must say I've missed you. It's been 3 Sundays. I haven't been here, and I'm glad you're back. Hope you had a happy Christmas. I hope you have a happy New Year. And I want to make one announcement. And I was hoping that Toddy Whitlock would be here before I make it, but I don't see her. What? Well, she works at her own pace. Some of you have been kind enough to ask about a column that I publish each week. And so I brought a few copies of them. I see they're already gone. But I did keep one because it sort of features Toddy Whitlock.
I've got one to give to the church too.
I write this every week. It's published by a company called the Center for Progressive Christianity. Is that right? And it goes out all over the world. It's opened about 100,000 times a week. And it's made up of 2 features. One is an essay.
Yes.
There she is. One is an essay, and then there's a question and answer that I get from audiences wherever I speak. And this week the question comes from Toddy Whitlock, so she's now famous. She's been read in Cambodia and in Thailand and in China and in Singapore and in England and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and a few places around the world. And so I thought you might like to see it. I printed up 10 of them. I didn't realize it goes so quickly. So Toddy didn't even have one, but I'll give you one, Toddy. Interestingly enough, for St. Peter's people, if you were here on December the 19th when I preached Sunday before Christmas, basically I turned that sermon into the column, and then I put Toddy Whitlock's question at the end of it, so it's sort of a St. Peter's issue. If anybody's interested in that, there's a place you can sign up to receive it. And it keeps me sort of sharp to have to write it. Well, let's go back. Let me take a minute to refresh our minds for those who've attended the 2 sessions we had in December, and to introduce those of you who have not been here. Our topic in this 5-week session is to try to discover Christianity before the Gospels were written, which surprises a lot of people who don't have a sense of history, because they can't imagine that there was a Christianity before the Gospels were written. The first thing we did was to put the New Testament on a time grid, a history grid, so that people can begin to see the development of our faith story. And we went over this in some detail. I will not do it in detail, but let me just file it. The dates for the life of Jesus are 4 BCE to 30 CE. And I went into reasons why we come to that conclusion that I won't repeat. This means that the life of Jesus, the earthly life of Jesus, comes to an end about the year 30 CE, and between 30 and 51, we have not a single shred of written data that's ever been preserved about him. So the first 21 years after the life of Jesus, we cannot penetrate. We call it a dark, silent tunnel. The church traditionally calls it a place where the oral tradition was passed on. The story was passed on by word of mouth. But nobody can frame what was exactly passed on because it wasn't preserved. It's hard to preserve an oral transmission. And we have to face the fact that we have this impenetrable tunnel between 30 and 51 that in the next 2 sessions I'm going to try to penetrate. The first written material we have that's in our Bible, in our New Testament, comes between 51 and 64, which is when Paul did his writings. Now, it's fascinating to look at that, what we have when we get to Paul. First thing that you need to know is that there are 14 epistles in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul. Scholars today believe that 7 of them alone are authentic. They are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Philemon, and Philippians. We are quite sure that Paul is the legitimate author of those 7 works. Then there are 3 epistles that are attributed to Paul that appear to be written within a decade after his death and probably by one of his disciples. And they are 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. And then there are 3 epistles we call the pastoral epistles, which are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, that were written somewhere between 80 and 100, and Paul had been dead somewhere between 16 and 35 years before those were written. And yet we still have people that stand up in St. Peter's and say, our lesson this morning is from the Epistle of Paul to Titus. And I want to stand up and say he'd been dead 25 years before that book was written. Now that doesn't mean that these books are worthless. But it does mean if we want to get back as close as we can to the earliest and most authentic voices of our Christian foundations, we can't start with post-Pauline work. There's one other epistle that only the King James Bible thinks was written by Paul. That's the epistle to the Hebrews. I said last time we met that I could make a better case for Bill Keel being the author of that epistle than I can for Paul. There's no way Paul could have written that particular epistle. But even when we get Paul, and you get Paul between 51 and 64, it's already 21 to 34 years after the life of Jesus. Even when you get to Paul, you get almost nothing about Jesus. Paul's writing letters, and just occasionally he makes a reference. What do you know about Jesus from Paul? We know that Jesus was, quote, handed over. That's the word that is later translated betrayed, but it's only handed over in Paul. Paul seems to have no sense that the betrayal was by one of the 12. You learn that Jesus was crucified. Paul makes a number of references to that, but he tells you no details from the crucifixion story. There's no such thing in Paul as the 2 thieves on each side of him, the story of Barabbas, the story of the trial, the story of anything Jesus said to anybody. That's just not there. There's no virgin birth in Paul. That comes much later. There's no Judas in Paul. There's no teaching of Jesus in Paul. There are no parables. Paul is not aware that Jesus ever did a miracle. We can find no evidence that a miracle was ever associated with Jesus of Nazareth until the 8th decade of the Christian era. There was no Pentecost experience. There was no ascension story. All of these things are themes that are introduced later. They're not Pauline. Then you come to the period between 70 and 100. That's the period in which the 4 Gospels were written. And I put 88 here to feature, and I'll get to that in just a minute. The first Gospel was Mark. We date it today somewhere on the other side of the fall of Jerusalem, which took place in 70, when the Roman army destroyed the city and destroyed the Jewish nation. I date Mark between 70 and 72, probably on the high side of that. What Mark introduces into the Christian tradition, which has never been there before, in written form, is John the Baptist. Nobody had ever heard of John the Baptist in any written form until Mark writes, 8th decade. Judas Iscariot makes the first appearance. Mark is the one who introduces and associates miracles with Jesus. And Mark is the one that gives us the first narrative of the details of the crucifixion. This is where you meet Barabbas. This is where you hear Jesus speaking from the cross into the crowds and to Pilate. And interestingly enough, in that first gospel, there is no resurrection appearance of Jesus to anybody. All you get in Mark is an empty tomb, a messenger who says he has been raised, and go to Galilee and you will meet him there. Never does the risen Christ appear. Now, if you're good students and go home and take out your King James Bible and dust it off and open it up and read Mark chapter 16, you'll discover that there are verses 9 through 21 in chapter 16 where there's some resurrection appearances. That's a later addition to Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel ends at verse 8. There was a great debate in the church as to whether somebody tore off the last page of the scroll because they couldn't believe that the first Gospel writer would not have a single story of the resurrection appearances. But most scholars today believe that Mark ended his Gospel exactly where verse 8 ends the Gospel. But anyway, that's Mark. And that's all the Christian story had